All right, we're talking about the Cold War. This is right after World War II. And we're going to cover pretty much an early part of the Cold War, which is essentially the 1950s. For the most part, it's the 1950s. You got to understand, World War II ended with the dropping of the two atomic bombs, but it also triggered the arms race of the Cold War. The Soviets immediately began to distrust Americans. And this essentially, for the next, well, at least until 1992, we can argue we have the Cold War. Some people still argue it's ongoing even now. It depends on the historian or political scientist and their point of view. But nonetheless, we do have to ask ourselves a question. How is it that the Soviets and the United States go from being allies in World War II, fighting fascism and Hitler, to, at this point here, the peak of the early Cold War, where we come closest to destroying the world as possible ever, is in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So everything we talk about for the most part leads us up to here today. We're going to go through all the process of the 1950s, but the high point I'd like to start with is the end game right here in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So real quick, this is the quick, fast version of it. The Cuban Missile Crisis essentially was, at this point, JFK is president of the United States. Cuba has had an overthrow of a brutal dictator, and it was Fidel Castro that took over. Fidel Castro is going to install his government. He's going to align himself with Russia, or Soviet Union, sorry, and just basically because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the United States had tried Bay of Pigs invasion. They pretty tried to invade and overthrow Castro before. There were plans in their works to have him assassinated. And so Cuba looks at the famous old saying, enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the enemy of the United States was Russia. And so you'll see in this picture, the leader of Russia at the time was Khrushchev, and Castro become good friends. Now, essentially what happens is because Cuba becomes communist, the United States would place an embargo, which is no trading at all with Cuba. That's why even to this very day, they have some really cool old cars. They couldn't import anything over. Now, in 1962, there is a United States spy plane going over Cuba, and they snap this picture here. And that picture shows them, I don't know how they can tell, but it shows them that there are nuclear weapons or missile silos being built in Cuba, and they're large enough where the only thing that could possibly be going in there are nuclear weapons. And this is 1962, the peak of everything, right? So this is high point, some of the best stuff. If the missiles at the time in 1962, you could short range, you could hit that first circle area here. Long range, you can go this far if you're firing from Cuba. So now, for the first time ever, America is in danger of being destroyed by the Soviet Union. I know now you're like, oh, there's ICBMs that go around the world. At this point in history, those didn't exist yet. We had short range, and that was it. So JFK has to make a decision on what to do, and his decision is to put a naval blockade around Cuba. If you look, you can see the so-called naval blockade around Cuba. And he says, no Soviet ships are allowed to enter. If you do try to enter, we're going to stop and search you to make sure you're not carrying any nuclear missiles. Now, first of all, I have something on here. I was like, he didn't call it naval blockade because according to international law, a blockade was illegal. It was an act of war. So JFK calls it a quarantine. He's going to isolate Cuba and quarantine it like communism is a sickness. Essentially, it's what he's referring to. In the end, it's a naval blockade. We're just going to coin a different term to justify it. And Soviet ships are headed that way. So for 13 days, Americans, the world watched in horror as to what was happening for 13 days. Soviet ships stopped very short of their quarantine line. There's a couple of stories that a couple actually went over the line and went back secretly. And through some back talk between ambassadors and friends at dinner tables outside official government communications, there was an agreement that the Soviets would remove missiles that were there and not install any more missiles. And the U.S. would agree never to attack Cuba again. And secretly, they would pull nukes out of Turkey, which at the same time was close enough for them to hit Moscow. So for Russia or Soviets, it was a win. For Americans, they backed out of it. But in the end, if you're looking for like the STAAR test, a big thing here is Cuba is communist. They Soviets try to put nuclear missiles there, and JFK blockades it and calls it a quarantine. You have to know that he calls it quarantine and what it is. The red phone down here at the bottom, this is actually why they put the red phone in the presidential office. It's a direct line to the Soviet leadership, and that was because in the process of 13 days, the best way of communication was actually pretty much like a telegraph sort of between both sides, and it was, you never knew who was actually speaking on the other side. At one point, JFK's advisors, the military, was trying to convince JFK to strike nuclear weapons into Russia immediately. And when a message came in that said, hey, stay calm, the JFK's military leaders, advisors, would tell JFK, that's probably somebody else over there, that's probably not Khrushchev. It's the hardliners over there that's overthrown it. So the United States has puts a red phone in a front office, and we're going to use it as a direct line to Soviets in case anything happens. But 13 days, closest we ever come to a nuclear war, and the world's at a standstill watching. Because if these two guys are firing at each other, it's over. Okay, so how do we get to that point? Well, let's start here. And after World War II, things are different. You gotta remember, during World War II, you had rationing, so this picture would not have been possible. Before World War II and rationing, you had the Great Depression. This would not have been possible. But this picture alone really tells you how the 1950s are. Abundant, consumerism, slightly materialistic. There was this pent-up eagerness to buy stuff that people had always wanted, stuff they wanted their kids to have because they didn't have because they were in the Great Depression. There's new manufacturing processes, more mass production. Kids could go stop at the store on the way home and get a soda. Like soda was a big thing. Post-World War II, in the 1950s, this is actually the best decade for the economy in U.S. history. When you hear this phrase, make America great again, it doesn't mean anything like it used to. In the 1980s, Reagan said it as a reference to the 1950s. The economy-wise, that's what Reagan continuously meant in the 1980s. Hey, we need to make it great again like it was in the 50s after the war. In modern times now, politicians steal it, and they steal it from Reagan because they want people to think they're like Reagan. But nonetheless, this is consumerism in the 1950s. I need you to understand that economy in the 1950s, awesome. Flat out awesome. People want to spend money at huge amounts like never before. I mean, to give you an example, 1950s is when McDonald's is born, just to give you an idea of what's going on in America and the economy. Now, this Cold War that we have, essentially you can define the Cold War as a war between us, U.S., and the Soviet Union, but we never attack each other directly. It's cold because it never gets that far. Now, we will fight each other through adversaries, like we'll support South Korea. The Soviets will support North Korea. And same thing with the Vietnam War and other parts all over the world, especially in the Middle East. But we're at what we call the Cold War, right? And of course, it all starts with us dropping atomic bombs. Now, the difference between us and communism, I'm not going to go too much in detail because this is the short version of it. But essentially, the Soviet Union is run by a communist party with one man in charge, and that's Joseph Stalin. Total control versus what we have in America, multi-party system. The economic system, the state and Soviet communism, they actually own everything. Farms are owned by the government, and people work those farms, and they get paid to work those farms. Here in America, if you own a farm, you work the farm, and then you sell your crop, and then any extra any crop you have left over after consuming, you sell it. And with that extra money, you can buy another tractor. You can buy more land. You can expand, right? We have the free enterprise system where you own your land or you own your company and you make money and you try to expand. Versus over here, these guys, Soviet communism, you don't have any incentive because no matter how well your farm does, any extra crop, they would take and feed it to somebody else in the country who might be going through a famine or something like that. So the economic system is entirely different. Now, there's downs and ups. In Soviet communism, your healthcare is paid for, your education completely paid for, versus American democracy where the government does not interfere, right? The government's supposed to stay out of everything. And so it's all private party, privately owned. Education becomes very expensive. You know how bad healthcare system is in America. So there's some ups and downs for both of them. But for us, you don't have to know the ups and downs. You understand how incredibly different they are. Now, I do have this one thing here about religion. Religion is very different. Soviet communism, religion is discouraged to the point where it's like if you are religious, you have to register with the government and you'll never get a government job. It was frowned upon. That's because for Russia's Soviet communism, there's the idea that the working people will revolt against the capitalist pigs who control everything, and there will be equality for everybody. Kind of hard to do that if you have a religion, and which is all the basic religions, by the way. If your religion teaches you suffer now, you'll be rewarded in the afterlife. That's kind of contradictory to the Soviet communism concept of overthrowing capitalist pigs, right? While in American democracy, you have complete freedom of exercise. Now, I bring this point up not to mess with or get religious points of views or anything like that, but actually to show you this right here. You see, if you get a dollar bill before 1956, you're going to see a blank spot up here, versus after 1956, you'll see "In God We Trust." You see, when founding fathers first started this beautiful, awesome country, the national motto was "E pluribus unum," which means "out of many, one." Okay, let me say that again. Out of many, one. And that was our national motto. Perhaps it was out of 13 colonies, one country, out of many types of people, one person, American, right? Nonetheless, up until 1956, that was our unofficial national motto. But the 50s, we have the Cold War going, and there's a suggestion to show the Soviets how Christian we are, how we are a God-fearing country, and how they don't allow that, we do allow it, and we love it, and we trust it. And so we changed the national motto in 57 to "In God We Trust." When you take the state test, you'll see things from what does "E pluribus unum" mean? 1 year they asked that. One time they said, why did we change it? And it was to show an adversary country that we were a Christian nation. You gotta understand we do this in a Cold War. And the only reason we actually do this is because we're trying to prove a point essentially to the Soviet Union to prove that we are religious, right? All right. So when we look at how this all forms, clearly we're different than democracy and communism, different by that table. You can see that. But a lot of people, historians, do blame it on this man right here. This is Truman. This picture number one, we got FDR, Churchill, Stalin, good friends. They just did at Yalta and Potsdam Yalta Conference. They decided they're going to divide up Germany. They're going to create the United Nations. They're going to have free elections, or so the Soviets say they will. But 6 months later, FDR is dead. They're meeting again to figure out how to beat Japan. War in Europe's over. But 6 months later, now it's Truman. This guy is a new president. Still Churchill, still Stalin. The other countries haven't had a change in leadership. And now things are just different. Truman's sketchier towards Stalin. Truman knows because that atomic bomb, he didn't need Joseph Stalin's help. And of course, some people, historians have also argued Truman has what we call little man syndrome. That's a whole other story for itself. But we see the differences begin to emerge. After Hitler's gone, our common enemy, we don't have much in common anymore. And then if you look at politics aside, there's an argument that FDR kept that relationship between him and Stalin as a close friendship. And Truman was not like that. Truman was not that at all. So if we look at Europe, this is like ground zero for the Cold War. If we go into that, you'll see that we made this agreement and they stuck through it. They're going to divide up Germany. If you see here, we're going to have... we'll have Great Britain take one part, Germany, United States takes another part, and France takes a third part. And we're all going to run that respective territory. And Soviets have East Germany. Now, if you zoom in on East Germany, you'll see that it's kind of sketchy. The capital of all of Germany is here in Berlin. And Berlin is right in the middle of East Germany. Now, if you're wondering how's that fair, it's not fair. So what we agree with the Soviets is that we would divide Berlin in half as well. And guess what? This side, the west side, will be democracy, and this side will be communist. So East Berlin is communist, just like East Germany is communist. Over time, the three friends, I guess you could say, Britain, France, and United States, will merge into one and call themselves West Germany. Okay. Now Berlin is still divided in half at that point in time, but Stalin's not going to be happy that everybody's pretty much ganging up on him, or at least that's the way he feels, right? But so we do have Germany split in four. If you actually look at this term phrase I have here, Iron Curtain, I don't know if they ever asked this on a test, but it's a term Churchill gave. He said, hey, if you look at Europe, we'll see an Iron Curtain, a metaphor, he says, an Iron Curtain coming across Europe. On one side, you have democracy. On the other side, you have communism. And this Iron Curtain is not easily moved. It's not easily moved. It's not easy to get rid of communism or get rid of democracy. This is becoming an issue. So I always teach students to understand this. East Europe, communism. East Germany, communism. East Berlin, communism. Every part in the East. But you can see how this is going to be ground zero for, essentially, it's going to be ground zero for the Cold War. Europe is the main fighting front for this. First time we see that overplay is with the new policy the United States comes up with. What do we do with communism? Well, we're not going to go to war. We're done with war. We're tired of war. People don't want war anymore. So we agreed that we're not going to go in and overturn communism where it is, but we agree that we're going to stop it from spreading. We're going to contain it. Stop communism from spreading is your definition of the containment policy. Contain communism. Very simple. That's going to dictate us for next, till this very day, I would argue. 70 years later, we still believe in that policy, not letting communism spread. Not as serious as it used to be. We're going to see this first play out in Greece and Turkey. Zoom in on our map, for you guys who don't know who Greece and Turkey is. You can see how close Greece and Turkey are to the Soviet Union. And we call these are what we call satellite nations. Nations pretty much controlled by the Soviets. They're close by like a satellite. But those governments in those countries I just circled, they're all communist because the Soviets control them. Now, our containment policy, a policy that dictates for decades, that we follow by for decades, is first put to a test here. First of all, in Greece, there's rebellion. It's a civil war. Communists are starting to take over Greece. Then you have Turkey here. Turkey, they owe the Soviets money, and the Soviets are threatening to invade Turkey and install a government of their choice, which would be, of course, communist. So Truman is president at this time. He's got to decide, how do I deal with this situation? And he will issue the Truman Doctrine. Now, important you know this. Truman Doctrine said that we will give military aid. Military is the key point here. To anyone fighting communism. Any country fighting communism will give you military aid. Weapons, planes, tanks, whatever you need, whatever military aid you need, we will give it to you. Okay? And you do need to know for a state test, this first tested in Greece and Turkey. Technically, the Truman Doctrine only applied to Europe. A lot of people don't know that, but technically that was only it. So how do we memorize that? The Truman Doctrine was for Greece and Turkey, and it said we would give military aid to anybody fighting against communism. Remember, containment policies stop it from spreading, but don't invade, don't overthrow a government, just stop it from spreading. That's the key here. Now, the Marshall Plan was another part of our response to communism post-World War II. And the Marshall Plan said we're going to give massive financial aid to Europe. Everything's been destroyed in Europe. Life sucks. And the whole point of this, of the Marshall Plan, the entire point of this, was we're going to give money to our allies so that they're happy. See, Secretary of State Marshall learned after World War I, Germany had a democracy. After World War I, they had democracy, but life sucked there so bad, they're so miserable and horrible that people turned to a dictatorship instead. That's how bad democracy had been in Germany. Like, they just rather be with Hitler, this crazy nut job. So Marshall says if we really wanted to keep these allies and keep this part of Europe, the western part of Europe, democracy, we should make their lives so awesome that they would never turn to communism. So let's give them money. They can rebuild their infrastructure. Roads, bridges, schools, buildings, the whole infrastructure, rebuild it. We'll give them tons of money. You can see how much money we give France and United K. We'll even put a ton in West Germany. Okay, we're going to give them tons of financial aid to rebuild. And that way, if you live in West Germany, the democracy side, and life is awesome. You got running water, you got hot water, you got schools, you got good roads, you got TVs. But you hear about your family in East Germany, and they don't even have hot water. They don't have jobs all the time. As a matter of fact, the communist TVs actually would blow up. That's a whole other story, but life was miserable in East Germany. But West Germany, under democracy, it was awesome. And we made sure that we sent money over there to make sure it was awesome. And we want to keep people happy in those democracies. Again, Marshall Plan, financial aid, money to Europe. Keep these our allies. Now, technically, it also went to places like China as well, but for a STAAR test, you just need to focus on Europe as a key point of the early part of the Cold War. Now, I told you that these three parts of Germany would form as one, West Germany, and which is great, and it made sense because the United States was pretty much doing all the work. Just kidding. But the United States was pretty much doing most of the guiding and whatnot. So eventually they will decide to merge it as what they call West Germany. Now, if you're Joseph Stalin, you wake up one day and you get word, hey, they all united together as one. You might feel a little bit threatened. You might feel a little bit upset, feel a little bit attacked, maybe your ego's been hurt. So Joseph Stalin's reaction was, all right, you do that, I'm going to do something else. I won't attack you. Remember, we're not fighting. This is the Cold War. But what I will do is take this city of Berlin, the capital, and Joseph Stalin will surround it and put a blockade on it. He says those railroads that lead from your part of Germany over here, blocked off. Those roads that you guys bring supply trucks on, blocked off. He's not going to allow it. He can do that. Like, he controls all the outside parts. He has blockade around the whole thing. So he says, you're not allowed in Berlin. So Truman has to decide what to do. According to containment theory, we can't let communism spread not 1 inch, not even to half of a city, not even half of Berlin. We cannot let that happen. So Truman starts the Berlin Airlift. For over a year, planes will take off every 4 minutes from different parts of, UK helped a lot as well, different parts of West Germany over here. All kinds of different airplanes over here will take off every 4 minutes, land in our side of Berlin, in the black there, and then take off and come back. And every 4 minutes, the plane was leaving, either this part of West Germany, come in, unload the plane, fly back out. And it was so perfectly organized. You can actually see some of these graphs that show you that they're flying in so close to each other that they had to fly different altitudes to make sure they didn't hit each other. That's how fast. They redid the entire West Berlin airport to make sure planes could come in, land in a certain way, and come out really fast. Nonstop for over a year. Truman had said, under no circumstance do we let it spread. Okay, we're not going to let communism spread. That's a containment policy. So even half of a city would not become part of a communist, the Soviet Union's communist control, not even half a city. And so it takes a lot of supplies to keep that city open. And so we do this for over a year. Eventually, Stalin opens up the roads and says, okay, you can bring stuff in, whatever. But nonetheless, the Berlin Airlift was that nonstop of dropping air supplies off and then leaving, because we didn't want them to become communist. We didn't want half of a city, Berlin, our half, to become communist. So the Berlin Airlift, very important. Now, over time, we realized at any point we get a little worried that the Soviet Union, what if they invade, Yugoslavia, just attack Yugoslavia and make them communist. Yugoslavia actually was communist. So that's a bad example. What if Bulgaria attacked Greece? And the Soviets say, oh, it's not us, it's Bulgaria. We just give them weapons, or something like that. What if one day the Soviets do attack West Germany? West Germany can't stand on its own. So pretty much America creates this idea, this concept of an alliance. It's called a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Because guess what? This is the Atlantic Ocean. And this is the north part of the Atlantic Ocean. And you got United States, Canada, and several different countries in Europe, all agreeing on one thing. They're all part of the North Atlantic area. And so they call themselves North Atlantic Treaty Organization that says, attacking one of us is attacking all of us. We have an alliance, an open alliance. Nobody will attack you or will help you. We promise. Now, Soviets don't like that, and they respond with the Warsaw Pact, which pretty much says the communist Soviet Union and its close by countries, whether they want to or not, are now part of the Warsaw Pact, which said the same thing. So now the world has picked sides, or at least Europe has. Are you NATO, or are you Soviet? NATO still exists to this very day. NATO is one of the reasons why in Ukraine there is a big issue. Ukraine wanted to join NATO, and Putin was like, no, we don't want NATO people that close to us, blah, blah, blah. And so he invaded. That and other weird reasons, some lies, some true. But nonetheless, even to this very day, NATO does affect the world and does have military control over certain parts of it. Now, this is not asked on test, so I'm going to go over this really fast. But for a while, you could escape communist part of Europe. So say you're like, okay, I want to escape, and you come to Germany, and you cross over from Austria or any part of Soviet-controlled Europe on the east side. That's all communism. You come over here, and you drive up to Berlin. If you zoom in at Berlin here, you'll see that you have the three sectors who eventually combine as one. And then you have the city, the other half of the city, the east side of the city. And if you were smart, you just went to Berlin, walked across here, and then flew out. Walked across here, and flew out to Great Britain. There's nothing stopping you from crossing over the city. Why would you? Cross over the city and fly out, that's it. And the Soviets were losing scientists, artists, celebrities. It was embarrassment. And they're losing really good people that were leaving the communist side. They would get all the way to the East Germany, get to Berlin, go across a border, hop in that airport on the western side and fly out like nothing. And so Soviets decided we got to do something about that. And what they decided to do is build a wall, okay, separating their side and essentially the American side eventually, the rest of the world. But the Americans really control most of this. We have the means and desire to do that. And so they would build this wall right here separating the city in half, known as the Berlin Wall. You can see from this picture, clearly one side is the democracy side, is the one with the painting, right? Because if you got freedom of speech, freedom of expression, you can walk right up and paint on that. Nobody's gonna stop you. On the other side, you've got military patrol, making sure nobody crosses the fence here, gets through here, and climbs the wall. They're not letting anybody out. You can clearly see when you look at the Berlin Wall, it becomes a metaphor for the Cold War. When the Berlin Wall actually finally fell in 1992, 30 years later, everybody used that as the end of the Cold War. Like, the Cold War is over. Yeah, the Berlin Wall falls. For 30 years, Berlin was divided, and people couldn't see their families. Like, for 30 years, like that first day, people woke up and weren't allowed to cross over. Like, people lost their jobs. They lost touch with their families. Imagine Houston being cut in half, just boom, all of a sudden cut in half one day, and you couldn't get to the other side. That's what happened to these people. And that Berlin Wall, by the time it was full force and a full-on security, it was almost impossible. Here's the actual border over here on this side right here. So this is actually what we call the Berlin Wall. It's called tall concrete with these round parts on top, so it's not easy to climb over. And so East Germany, the communist side, they started building up on it this far inland. And what they did was, essentially, if you wanted to climb that wall, you had to go through these iron crosses, so you couldn't drive a vehicle, or you couldn't drive a tank through there. You got a sand ditch there to slow down the vehicle, if not stop it completely. You had vehicle patrolled here. You had watchtowers. You had underground bunkers where guards could stick their heads up to see what's going on and shoot you. You had patrols all the time with guard dogs. You had spikes in the ground. And then you had the fence here that you were crossing over, the barbed wire on top, and another concrete wall. So coming from East Berlin, coming this way, you had a lot of obstacles you had to get through somehow just to get to a wall and climb over. And very few people did. And it wasn't like you could just go get a visa and travel. They did not give those. They trapped families and everything. And the Berlin Wall becomes the symbol of the Cold War. It's crazy how it is everything the Cold War. Everybody thinks about Cold War. Nobody can think of the Cold War without the Berlin Wall. Now, Europe wasn't the only place the Cold War plays out. 1949, Mao Zedong is fighting to create a communist country in China, and they actually been doing this for a long time before World War II. But after World War II, once the Japanese are beat and left, the nationalists, which are pro-democracy, are fighting against the communists to take control of China, and the communists went out. If you look at this map, the communists beat the nationalists, the democracy people out, and the nationalist democracy would fly to the island of Taiwan and start their own government there. Like, you can go to Taiwan's website now, and they swear one day they would take back mainland China and make it a democracy. It's kind of a joke now. This is also why China doesn't recognize Taiwan as a country. And leaders, when they talk in front of China, or the United States at least, they don't refer to Taiwan as a separate entity. Like, we have an agreement with China that it's not. But that agreement is recent. It's actually really confusing. It doesn't make much sense. All right, so for the STAAR test, you need to know Mao Zedong, communists, in 49, they take over China. China becomes red. It's a huge blow to democracy across the world. Millions of people are now communists. One of the largest countries in the world is now communist, and it's a big issue. And you also need to understand that nationalists flee to Taiwan. Now, as a result, the United States refuses when China tries to join the United Nations at that point in history. The United Nations is well underway by 49. It's been around for a couple of years. We veto their entry, and we don't let them enter the United Nations. We refuse to do so because they're communists. Truman also makes a pledge. He says, Taiwan, if any communist country ever attacks you and tries to invade you, we will support you. That's why it's a really awkward situation for America now, because we have that pledge to always support Taiwan no matter what. But we also have an agreement with China that we won't, Taiwan is not its own country. Give you an example, George Bush in the early 2000s addressed the United Nations, and he literally said, welcome everybody from China to Taiwan. And China was upset because that sounds like he's recognizing Taiwan as a country. He said the name like it's an actual country. And so Bush's people had to apologize to China right away. And they're like, oh, no, he misspoke. We're not officially recognizing Taiwan. But we do agree to support them no matter what. And China wants and swears that they're going to make it part of China. If you get a map in China, Taiwan is not labeled Taiwan. It's part of China, period. But nonetheless, that's how communism has spread in China with Mao Zedong as a leader. And then we have the Korean War, often the forgotten war. To the right here, you're going to see this is North Korea. This is South Korea. This is actually China. That's how close Korea is to China. It's at the southern part of China. Before World War II, like in 1910, actually way back, Japan had controlled Korea, the peninsula, and treated people horribly, absolutely horribly. Japan had done that for years. After World War II, Japan loses all its territory, including the Korean peninsula. And on this peninsula, they have to decide what they're going to do, if they become North, if they become communist, or democracy. And pretty much Soviet Union and the United States don't give the people in Korea choice like they do other parts. They just agree, hey, the North will be communist and the South will become democracy. Now, over time, in 1950, World War II's been over for 5 years. Stalin in Russia convinces North Korea, hey, you know what you guys should do? You should invade the South. Americans don't care about Korea. It's not in Europe. It's really far away. There's only like 400 U.S. soldiers in South Korea, and they're essentially just advisors. They're not actually fighting. So essentially, North Korea decides we're going to attack South Korea and invade it. If you want to see how far they of all this, it's used and put in charge was a guy named MacArthur. You guys remember him? Hero of World War II. Everybody loves him. Most old people do. Young people know how dumb he is. What MacArthur has done, it's pretty impressive at the very first. Korea, MacArthur actually says, we need to drop atomic bombs on China. China's reaction, go ahead. We have enough people. And MacArthur has been open about this. He tells Truman, we need to do this. We need to drop atomic bombs on China. Truman is not, he says we can't do this. After Hiroshima, there's specific historians that work on Truman's life and biography and everything. They've often argued that Truman was, when he got the reports back for Hiroshima, he was devastated. Like, he didn't realize what he had done. So using an atomic bomb, he was very reluctant to use it. And Truman refused it. He said, we're not using an atomic bomb on China. We're not at war with them. We can't just use it. MacArthur goes to the public. He tells everybody how Truman is a scaredy cat, to use nice words. And Truman fires MacArthur. after that. And MacArthur had to know he was going to get fired for this. You can't go to the public about the president and not get fired. Like, you know it's going to happen. Now, think about it. MacArthur's a war hero. Truman fires him. Do you think Truman's going to get reelected? No, of course not. So MacArthur is fired by Truman. Take a look at this graph here. Okay, that's how close they get to actually conquering all of Korea. Truman's reaction is, all right, we got to send in troops. We have to do something. Takes a big risk, sends in troops from the side here and to push from the south. And it works. Look how far back they push the communist forces. Then all of a sudden, these soldiers in the north here, they start radioing back. The soldiers start radioing back. They say the Chinese are coming. The Chinese are coming. It turns out, and generals are like, dude, those are North Koreans, not Chinese, you idiots. But it turns out Chinese soldiers are going to cross the border from China into North Korea by 100,000 plus and help the North Koreans drive the Americans back. Now, China's official stance, when we're like, are you declaring war on America, China? And China says, oh, that's not Chinese, or those aren't official Chinese soldiers. Those are just Chinese people with our guns and our uniforms and our weapons. They're mercenaries. They're people that decide to do it on their own. We're not paying them. We have no affiliation with them. They're not the Chinese army. Obviously, we know they are. They're communists and they're all united together. How could they get these weapons? How could they be so successful? Clearly, they are supported by China, but China just argues, it's not us. We can't control our people. And it works. They push if you look at this, they do push Americans further back. There is a slight push back before we have a truce, a timeout. Say, all right, let's stop fighting. Let's try to get a treaty. Now, the guy that Truman, right, when you first see it, pushes them back, China pushes back. Once MacArthur realizes it's China helping, and when we are still at a timeout. It's still an armistice, which means we don't have a treaty. We have a line drawn, and we say, let's stop right here, stop fighting. Everybody pull away. I think it's like 5 miles away from line. Pull your military weapons 5 miles away. Tanks, airplanes, all that have to be away from the this line, the armistice line, the demilitarized zone line. That's how Truman leaves office. We led the invasion, but the United Nations backed it. It was agreed by the United Nations, you can't invade another country. Soviets kind of pretended they had nothing to do with it at the United Nations. Like, oh, that wasn't us. Like, we had nothing to do with that. And China wasn't part of the United Nations. So they could get away with it, and there's nothing you could do about it. So we may have led that. Truman leaves. All that comes in after Truman. It's a man named Eisenhower. Remember Eisenhower? He was in commander of all of Europe. He is a great war hero. People love him. He is a Republican. And so finally, the Republicans are back in the White House. Not since the 1920s, when they ruined it and messed up and caused a depression. They're finally back in 1953. 1953 is when they're back. Eisenhower wins in November 52, takes office in 53. And you can see it's really interesting when you look at these two pictures. I love this. It just shows us that we don't have a military government. Like in the top picture here, this is actually Eisenhower briefing Truman about World War II. Because remember, Truman came in at the very end of World War II, all right? Eisenhower's general, he's briefing him. And what's crazy ironic is that years later, once Eisenhower beats Truman in the presidential race of 1952, here is Truman prepping Eisenhower to become president. It's a transition team you have when one president wins. That's the way it usually works. Only recently was it not a thing. But it's ironic, and because you see the big difference here is military uniform, he's retired from military. You can't be in the military running for president. We're a civilian-led military, so you just can't do that. So it's pretty interesting. Nonetheless, Eisenhower comes in, and he is determined to get this treaty, does not get a treaty. Instead, we have a permanent armistice. And to this very day, that armistice exists. And South Korea, North Korea, since 1950, has grown dramatically different. In case you didn't know, South Korea pop, South Korean cartoons and anime, whatever that junk is, versus North Korea, which is like a pretty much horrible hell on earth to live if you're North Korea. If you're wondering how it plays a role, the average North Korean is a foot shorter than their South Korean counterparts because they're so malnutritioned over the course of 2 generations. North Korea is communist, as it was then. And it's only a hereditary communist country. It is now on its third line since 1950. The third person, father to son, leaders of North Korea. I won't get too much. North Korea's a horrible place, but this is how it all starts, 1950. It's called the Forgotten War because most people don't know about it. And technically, both sides are still at war. There's never been a treaty. That North Korea war, we did that, but we weren't the only ones doing it. The United Nations supported us on that. All right, so that's just one part of the Cold War. We're involved. Soviets not involved. China's helping out, but it's clear democracy versus communist. And by the way, just make sure you understand, when we get to the Soviets themselves, we do have a lot of issues with them. Remember how he said the dropping atomic bombs in 1945 in Japan started the arms race with the Cold War. Soviets immediately began to work on the bomb, and by 4 years later, in 1949, they have the atomic bomb. Truman says, okay, that's pretty bad. He gives the go-ahead to try and make, and they are successful, the hydrogen bomb. And so we have the arms race. Who can make the bigger bomb, who can make more of them, and this is it. Both sides relied on this thing called deterrent. And that was the concept that if I have enough weapons, they would never launch a nuke at me, because if they do, they know I'll launch all mine at them. It's a deterrent, all right? And if you look at, if you actually look at, if you want to see how bad, Mike and Bravo are hydrogen bombs, okay? The largest bomb ever tested was a STAAR bomb, and there's a STAAR 2 that's never been tested. It's nuclear, that's nuclear obviously, right? It's huge, right? But hydrogen bombs, or the first one ever dropped was Mike. If you want to know how much bigger that is than an atomic bomb, you would have to zoom in here, and that's what this picture is right here, of Hiroshima. And even with that, like this, the bunker buster, that's the biggest bomb. That's not non-atomic. That's nothing, right? But Hiroshima was the first atomic bomb, the largest first atomic bomb. See how much bigger it really is compared to the hydrogen bomb. I mean, that itty bitty one is atomic. Now we have the hydrogen with Mike. It's huge. And so Soviets, they got to make a hydrogen bomb now, and they got to make more of them. Eventually, we're going to make nuclear bombs. It's going to take off. And of course, this is the arms race of the Cold War. But along with the arms race, you also have the space race. That starts with the Sputnik. The Soviets will launch Sputnik. It's the first man-made satellite into space. It'll circle the Earth, and it freaks Americans out. Sputnik freaks Americans out. It's nothing but this little bitty satellite here. It's barely bigger than basketball. All it can do is send a radio signal back to Moscow, to Soviets, and they can track it. That's it. But it does pass over the United States and all over the world when it goes around the world. And the Americans start to worry. If they can launch a satellite into space, how long will it be before they can launch nukes from space and hit us? And so we start looking at ourselves and say, man, let's look how they are. They're faster for us with math and science. They're better at math and science than we are. We start looking at our own education system and start realizing our tests, the like state tests, the whole concept behind it is to make sure we're keeping up with the rest of the world. Obviously, we're not doing that, but that was the whole point. Like the first tests start coming from math and science because we're losing to the Soviets. The federal government will start pouring money into math and science subjects. There's federal funding now for math and science. The first student loans that were ever forgiven were for science teachers. That was the first student loans way back in 2000s that they ever had a payment forgiveness plan for, was for science. It's always been, we gotta get our math and science scores better. We gotta be able to compete. So you could blame Sputnik for that, I guess. Federal government will fund math and science on an unbelievable large scale. We'll start testing to make sure our state is keeping up with the other states and our nation is keeping up with other nations. And the United States will start a new program called NASA. You may have heard that one. And their goal is to compete in space. And so Sputnik starts the space race. It starts NASA. It starts federal government funding of math and science. Sputnik changes everything. And there's one thing I need to make sure you understand. It also affects technology. Eventually, the space race forces, we're going to try to get astronauts into space. And if you ever thought about where sunglasses first came from, It came from NASA. Like, astronauts needed to shield their eyes when working in space, and there's no shade anywhere else, and so they created sunglasses for the visors. Motorcycle helmets got so perfect because of astronaut space helmets. The microwave itself was discovered because of the space program. Velcro, space program. GPS exists because of satellites in space. It's how they work. All these are technologies from the space program. And so the state test will ask that. Occasionally, they'll give you an example of some far out technology that you're like, I never even thought about that. What does that have to do with anything? And if you can connect it to a space race, it'd make a whole bunch of sense. So the space race changes everything. We all benefit from it in the long run, even though the premises of it's kind of sad. Now, back home, we're getting really worried. You guys remember the Red Scare from World War II? Well, now we have the second Red Scare. The first Red Scare after World War I. Now we have the second Red Scare after World War II. And this one's even more intense. Truman he asked Congress to start the House of Un-American Activities Committee to research anybody who is un-American. And they go after celebrities, mainly like writers, actors, singers, all these people, and they say, hey, you're friends with somebody in Russia, you're communist. Hey, you made this movie during World War II, and in this movie in World War II, you're best friends with a Russian. Why is that? And you're like, hey, in World War II, they were our allies against Hitler. So now you're Russian. Now you're communist. Now you love them, right? The House of Un-American Activities pretty much was just attacked celebrities left and right, saying that communism was in Hollywood. All these guys are evil. But it had a huge effect. When they called out Hollywood and these celebrities and writers and artists, and you were called out for being communist, even if there's no evidence, even if they put you in front of Congress and they decided you were fine, you can go, it didn't matter, because once your name was mentioned, you were like blacklisted, which pretty much means nobody would hire you again. Like your career was over. And they went far. Like they actually arrested people across the United States, all over the place, suspected of communist. And when you think about it, like that's not legal, because communist is a political party, and political parties are allowed in America. You're right, but people did not think twice. McCarthy. All right, so the House of Un-American Activities was from the House of Representatives. Flip side, you got this Ted Cruz lookalike here, McCarthy. This guy is one of the worst. This guy's like, you're seeing politicians now that are far right and nuts. This guy would have been fit right in with them. He will be the first to accuse the government of having communists inside the government. And he would go to media and say, there's 180 people inside the government that's communist I know of. And the next time he would say, there's 190. He would always make up numbers, randomly making up numbers. He had no evidence. If you ever wonder how sick of Congress was of him, take a look at this guy. This guy right here would tell you all you need to know. As Joseph McCarthy here starts going on and on about communists everywhere, and there's no evidence. It's a waste of time. It's all for publicity. Everything you see in politics today, you could really say it starts with this guy, McCarthy. It's so bad, his own party will censor him, and he'll actually not be allowed to speak in Congress. But for a time being, he gets a lot of attention, and he gets people to listen to him. And he actually creates a term called McCarthyism. So we make harsh accusations without evidence. Kind of like when we say it's a witch hunt, like from Salem witch trials, kind of the same thing, right? It's a witch hunt. They're going after people. McCarthyism was the same thing. That whole concept that we're going to go after communists, even if I have no evidence, and if you spoke against me, you're a communist. If you weren't normal and did what everybody else did, you're a communist. Everybody that did something we didn't agree with was communist. If it sounds familiar, not much has really changed. Just real quick, in case you do see this on tests, HUAC, that stands for House of Un-American Activities Committee. Just make sure, it helps to remember that. I mean, the name in it itself tells you you're looking for communists. So that should be an easy one. The Korean War increased pretty bad as far as anti-communist fears are concerned. That was communism at war with communist countries. Maybe not Soviet Union, but it's stretched pretty far. People were freaked out. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were some scientists, a married couple. They were arrested, put on trial for treason for selling atomic secrets to Russia, and they were put to death. 2 married scientists were charged with treason and executed. Now, we do discover in 1997 that there were several Americans in the American government that were spying for Soviets, and they were them as well. At the time, there was very little evidence. And so it became kind of, you know how we talk about Sacco and Vanzetti showed how freaked out people were of immigrants and communists after World War II? This is kind of the same scenario, but it's just a little bit different and made news because this was a couple, and they were charged with treason with little evidence at the time, and executed nonetheless. And the execution was horrible. Like if you go read about this, it's actually really, really sad. But it's by the electric chair that didn't work out like it should have. But nonetheless, this is how bad the Red Scare got, with even scientists were arrested and executed. And this is at the same time we took Nazi scientists and gave them safe haven because they were helping with rockets, but not those guys. I don't ever talk about this anymore. It's never been a big issue for STAAR concerned. But you remember the Truman Doctrine said we give military aid to any country in Europe fighting communism? When Eisenhower becomes president from 53 to 60, he has an Eisenhower Doctrine, which is the same thing, military aid to anybody fighting communism in the Middle East. And so we do start to get involved in the Middle East in huge numbers, but I can't go into details too much in this decade about U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Now, domestically speaking, Eisenhower saw a wonderful economy and he was actually a very moderate president when it came down to a few things. Creates the Interstate Highway Act, has the federal government pay for highways. It's a federal government. Never before has it happened. Everybody argues it's unconstitutional. And so he had crappy roads, depending on the state if they're worth anything. But he says, hey, we need interstates like what we have now, I-10, I-45, I-35. Those are interstate highway systems. And people argue, well, how can you do this? It's unconstitutional. Nowhere in the Constitution does say the federal government can do this, so the states have to do it. And Eisenhower made an argument. He said, hey, if we have to go to war and I got to transport troops, weapons, vehicles across the country, can I do that easily if there's no interstate? If it's all state by state and it's all trash? I cannot do that easily enough. And guess what? The Constitution does say the federal government is in charge of the defense of the country. So I need an interstate system to do that. And boom, interstates are born. So you can give that credit to Eisenhower. We also have, domestically speaking, inside America, the baby boom. You guys ever heard of boomers? The people that are really old, retiring, boomers, they were born during this time period. That's what they call boomers, because they're part of the baby boom. Soldiers came home and when they wake up for lost time and have babies. And they have huge families. And we're going to have a huge birth rate. You can see right here, if you look at this graph here, you'll see after World War II ends, the birth rate skyrockets. It's huge. It's abnormal. Like up to 1929, it's pretty low, and all of a sudden it takes off. Everybody's having children. Now, remember we said that during the New Deal, FDR created Social Security, where young people paid for old people's salary, their pension, their retirement pension. At this point in history, must have been awesome. At this point in history, there's plenty, when these guys turned 18, roughly about right here, when they turned 18, there's plenty of them to pay for old people's retirement, right? But what if when this whole group, years later, when they're retiring, 60 years later, there's too many old people and Social Security can't support them. So it's kind of downfall. The boomers are the downfall of Social Security because there's too many of them. Now, what this does create is it helps the economy. When we have a baby boom, it actually really helps the economy because more people need houses, more people need to buy things. Everything changes dramatically. And one thing that also helped the economy was the GI Bill. GI Joe, if you ever heard of them, is the GI Bill. It stands for General Issue. So whenever someone says GI, it was basically meant private soldier, nobody important. But the GI Bill itself was really important. It actually gave people money, or soldiers returning home, money for a house or money for college. It could be education, technical training, or money for a house. And so a lot of people bought houses, and houses were built in huge numbers. And you know, if the house system is great and wonderful, and people are buying houses, it creates jobs, and that essentially helps the economy. This is a decade of economic boom. The 1950s are awesome. But it also meant conformity. Everybody had to dress the same. Take a look at the homes. The first time ever we have suburbs. Homes are all built the same, right? Cookie cutter is what they're called because they all look the exact same. Now, the reason why we have these is because outside, transportation got really advanced, right? Cars are actually way different than they were in 1940s, 1930s, 1950s. These are reliable, durable cars. We see the big three emerge as far as car industries go. You got public transportation. You got interstates. Think of Houston. You have I-35 up and down, I-45. You got I-10, and you got the other roads that aren't interstates, but you got all these huge roads now going into Houston. So now you could work inside Houston and travel away, and you could live on the outskirts of Houston in what we call suburbs. If urban is Houston, the suburbs was around Houston. That's why they called it. So the Chevrolet has a Suburban. It was a big car that you could take the family in from your home into the city, the Suburban. From your home in the suburbs into the city. So transportation meant people could live close to cities to work and shop, but live outside in suburbs. And some suburbs grew so large, they eventually became cities of their own, like Cypress and Pearland. But we see suburbs everywhere now, right? And back then, that was just a big, huge thing. And as they grew, that meant the economy grew. But it only happened because transportation was getting so much better. Maybe not public transportation in Houston, but public transportation in other areas was huge. As far as medicine goes, Jonas Salk develops a polio vaccine. And then we had the first measles vaccine, we had the first heart transplant. We had the first antibiotics to treat tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, because of this vaccine, this antibiotic to treat it, and then the vaccines, tuberculosis almost completely erases from history up until a few years ago when we had all these anti-vaxxers coming out. And now it's on the rise, just like measles is here in Texas, if you know anything about that in the news currently. But hey, vaccines are over 50 years old, and now all of a sudden they don't work. Now all of a sudden they mess people up. But whatever. I'm being sarcastic, but nah. Okay. All right, you see some of these pictures show you what's going on. Look at these suburbs. Look how big it is, how massive it is. Might mind you a couple places in Baytown. I like this one because this Levittowner was some of the first houses built in a suburb. And if you look, what's the first thing you see? No cash required from veterans. If you fought in the war, you don't need anything down. No payments down. Boom. $6, $7 a month. $10,000 got you a home. Industry economy is booming. Women, if you're wondering what life was like for you, you left the factories and you went home and you cooked dinner and you took care of the kids. You had these Tupperware parties. I always liked this because plastic was discovered in the 1950s. And it was supposed to be this thing that saved us from using all the wood, using all the glass. It made everything affordable. Tupperware parties, I always bring this up because this woman here, this woman right here, she was getting all these people to sell Tupperware, and she would get a percentage of it. And then they would get other people to sell Tupperware out there, after all their friends, and she would get a percentage, and she would get another percentage as well. So if you look at one person on top, gets 3 people to sell, she gets a little bit of it. They get 3 people to sell. They get 3 people to sell each, and she's still on the top. Is still getting a percentage out of each person. It's got a Ponzi scheme. You might have heard of other things like it, right? The makeup people do it. People who sell knives, vacuum cleaners, books, encyclopedias. Tupperware, people still do it. People still sell Tupperware hoping that they can make money on it. Mary Kay is the makeup people that do it. But essentially, that's what it is. It's a Ponzi scheme, or a pyramid scheme is what it's called. But that's what life for women. You did show way too much skin at the beach for the first time. Shame on you. Just kidding. It's wonderful. All right, as far as music goes, remember talking about how everybody had to conform, your houses had to be the same, you had to act the same, everybody wanted to have kids. There were a few people that didn't conform, very few. These were called the Beatniks. And this term Beatniks, you do have to know. Not because they were like a huge influence on history, because they're not really. But these Beatnik guys that did poetry, snapped their fingers into drums, they were against conformity. And essentially, they do very little in span of, and when you look back in history, they have very little influence, but they will give birth to, the hippie movement. They are a precursor to the hippie movement, and the hippies changed everything in the 60s and 70s. Right? So the Beatniks were like the precursor, the prequel, if you will, to the hippie movement. That's why they're so important and discussed. Now, rock and roll, the music of rock and roll plays a big role too. And I know I hate talking about music when we talk about history because it seems irrelevant, but rock and roll actually starts in the 1950s. The guys like Chuck Berry and Elvis. I was always taught this, and it's taught even now. Elvis was famous because he sang like a black man. Rock and roll used rhythm and blues, what we call R&B now, mixed with a sped up beat, and it became rock and roll music. Chuck Berry here is black. Like the guy's one of the greatest rock and roll artists of all times. Elvis was one of the first ones, but he danced like he actually had rhythm, like he wasn't white to say. Now, historically speaking, when we talk about the 1950s rock and roll, why is it so important? Rock and roll did a couple of things. One, it separated generations. Like if you liked rock and roll, you were young, and it was you way different than the old people. Right. The first people like rock and roll become boomers eventually, ironically, right? But when they started liking rock and roll in the 50s, if you were in your 20s and 1950s listening to rock and roll, you did not like the same music as your parents. No parents like that, and it created a generation divide, like old versus young. And it does change things. It does start making people think differently about the older generation. And we know how far that eventually gets in the 60s and in the 70s. All right, now that's the Cold War in 1950s. As essentially all that built up as far as America's great economy and the music and the foreign issues builds up to the explosion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that's just the beginning of the Cold War. From 45 till the Cuban Missile Crisis 62 is just the beginning. From 60 all the way to 62, from all to 1992, it's just going to get worse.